"Come be my wife," said the mountain man after her in-laws shaved her head. They dragged her into the street, cut off her hair, and left her in the dust, just because she refused to marry the man who stole her husband's land. But when the crowd turned away, a silent stranger stepped forward. A man who lived alone in the mountains, known for his scars and his temper. He covered her shoulders with his coat and spoke 6 words that changed both their lives. What began as mercy soon became a fight for survival, love, and the truth about a husband everyone thought was dead. As snow falls and enemies close in, the line between protection and devotion starts to blur. In a world ruled by pride, law, and revenge, can 2 broken souls find grace before the storm takes everything? Or will their marriage of mercy become the reason they both fall? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Benton's Hollow's main street as a crowd gathered, their faces hard and judgmental. Dust swirled in eddies around Isla Hensley's feet as 2 of Caleb's ranch hands dragged her forward. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her chin lifted, even as tears threatened to spill. "You see here what becomes of a prideful woman." Caleb Hensley's voice rang out across the street. He stood tall in his pressed black coat, every inch the respected rancher. "My own brother's widow, refusing to honor family duty." Isla's voice trembled but stayed strong. "I won't marry you, Caleb. The land was James's gift to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others pressed closer, hungry for the spectacle. The preacher stood at the edge, his Bible clutched to his chest, lips moving in silent prayer. "Strip off her bonnet," Caleb commanded. "Let everyone see what becomes of a woman who puts herself above God's plan." Rough hands yanked away her blue cotton bonnet, sending hairpins scattering. Isla's dark hair tumbled down her back. She closed her eyes, fighting to stay upright as someone grabbed a handful of her hair. The scissors made an ugly sound. Snick, snick, snick. Long strands of hair drifted across the dusty street like dead leaves. Isla felt the cold metal against her scalp, heard the gasps and mutters of the townspeople. Her head grew lighter with each cut, until the wind burned against her bare skin. "There," Caleb said, satisfaction dripping from his voice. "Now everyone can see your shame. Maybe next time you'll remember a woman's proper place." From the back of the crowd, a mountain of a man watched. Thomas Boone's scarred hands tightened on his rifle stock, but his face remained still as stone. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. Caleb circled Isla like a wolf around wounded prey. "Last chance, sister dear. Marry me, and we'll forget this unfortunate display." Isla's legs shook, but she didn't fall. "Never." Caleb's face twisted. He spat at her feet, the glob of tobacco juice landing on her skirts. "Suit yourself." He turned away, gesturing for his men to follow. The crowd began to disperse, women hurrying away with averted eyes, men shuffling their boots in the dirt. Even the preacher turned his back, shoulders hunched with shame as he hurried toward his church. Isla stood alone in the street, arms wrapped around herself as the wind picked up her shorn hair and sent it tumbling like tumbleweed. Her scalp burned with cold, and her feet had gone numb in the dirt. The first snowflakes began to fall, tiny white specks that melted as soon as they touched the ground. Heavy bootfalls approached from behind. Isla flinched but didn't turn. A shadow fell over her, and something warm and heavy settled across her shoulders. The rich scent of leather and wood smoke enveloped her as Thomas Boone's bearskin coat wrapped around her trembling form. She looked up, way up, into eyes the color of autumn leaves. Thomas didn't speak, didn't offer empty comfort. He simply held out one massive hand, calloused palm up, waiting. Isla swayed on her feet. The world seemed to tilt and spin around her. Through the haze of shock and shame, she saw Thomas's hand remain steady, an anchor in the storm. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, she placed her much smaller hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and sure. Without a word, he led her to where his mule stood waiting. The creature's long ears flicked forward at their approach, dark eyes wise and gentle. Thomas's hands spanned Isla's waist as he lifted her onto the mule's back as easily as if she were a child. The bearskin coat engulfed her, its warmth beginning to seep into her bones. Thomas adjusted it carefully around her bare feet, tucking the edges to keep out the strengthening wind. His movements were deliberate and careful, like a man used to handling fragile things. Snow was falling steadily now, white flakes catching in Thomas's dark beard as he took the mule's lead rope. The sun had nearly set, painting the western sky in bands of purple and gold. Isla's head felt strange and light, her thoughts scattered like her hair across the street. They left Benton's Hollow behind, the mule's hooves making soft sounds in the gathering snow. Thomas walked beside them, his stride long and steady. He didn't look back at the town, and neither did Isla. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant coyotes. Isla clutched the bearskin closer, breathing in its wild smell. Her scalp stung in the cold, but the shame burned hotter. Still, something in her refused to break. She was James's widow, and no matter what Caleb did, he couldn't take her dignity. Thomas led them along a winding trail that climbed into the foothills. The snow fell thicker now, but he seemed to know every step of the way. Isla watched his broad back, the way he moved, with the sureness of a man who belonged to these mountains. The last light faded from the sky, leaving only the soft glow of snowlight to guide them. Isla's thoughts grew fuzzy around the edges. She swayed in the saddle, exhaustion and shock taking their toll. Just when she thought she couldn't stay upright another moment, Thomas stopped. He turned and caught her as she started to slip, his hands steady and strong. For a moment, their eyes met in the gathering dark. He didn't speak, but something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or a promise. Then he carefully adjusted the coat around her shoulders and took up the lead rope again. They continued on into the snowy night, leaving behind the town and its cruelties, while ahead the mountains rose like silent guardians against the star-filled sky. Around them, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, erasing all signs of the path they'd taken. Like a clean page waiting to be written upon, it offered the possibility of a new beginning, though neither of them could know yet what that beginning might bring. The mountain trail twisted upward through the darkness, each turn bringing them deeper into the wilderness. Snow fell steadily now, coating the pines in white. Thomas's broad shoulders were dusted with it as he led the mule carefully along the path. The cold had settled into Isla's bones, making her teeth chatter despite the heavy bearskin. Thomas stopped suddenly, his hand raised. "Ma'am." His voice was rough, as if unused to speaking. "Need you to drink something." He uncorked his leather canteen and held it up to her. When her trembling hands couldn't grasp it properly, he steadied it for her. The water was cold and fresh, tasting of the mountains themselves. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the night. They continued upward, the mule's hooves finding sure purchase even in the growing snow. The wind cut through the bearskin now, and Isla's shivering grew worse. Her shorn head felt like it was encased in ice, each gust a new torment against her exposed skin. Just when she thought she couldn't endure another step, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. A cabin, built of massive logs and nestled against the mountainside. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, disappearing into the night sky. Thomas helped her down from the mule, his hands careful but strong. Her legs buckled as soon as they touched the ground, and he caught her before she could fall. Without a word, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the cabin door. The interior was dark and smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke. Thomas set her gently in a chair near the cold stove, then moved with surprising efficiency in the darkness. The scratch of a match broke the silence, and suddenly warm light filled the cabin as he lit a lamp. The space was spare but neat: a plank table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding provisions. Everything spoke of solitude, of a life lived alone. Thomas stoked the stove with practiced movements, adding kindling and small logs until a fire caught. Heat began to seep into the room. He filled a battered coffee pot with water and set it on the stove, then disappeared into the back room. He returned with a thick patchwork quilt, which he wrapped around her shoulders over the bearskin. "Coffee'll help," he said quietly, measuring grounds into the pot. Isla's scalp throbbed, every inch where the scissors had scraped feeling raw and exposed. She touched it gingerly, wincing at the rough patches and uneven lengths they'd left behind. Tears threatened again, but she forced them back. She'd shed enough of those today. The coffee pot began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Thomas poured 2 tin cups full and handed one to her. The warmth of the cup seeped into her frozen fingers, and the strong brew helped clear her head somewhat. A scratching at the door made her start, but Thomas merely stood and opened it. A large battle-scarred dog slipped inside, shaking snow from his coat. One of his ears was notched, and a patch of white fur marked his chest. The source of his name, she would later learn. The dog gave her a long, measuring look, then settled by Thomas's feet as the man returned to his chair. The 3 of them sat in silence as the storm raged outside, the only sounds the crack of logs in the stove and the howl of wind through the pines. Exhaustion pulled at Isla like a physical weight. Thomas must have noticed, because he rose and quickly prepared the narrow bed with fresh blankets. "Rest," he said simply, gesturing to it. She was too tired to protest, too drained to worry about propriety. The bed smelled of clean straw and pine needles, and she was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. Dawn crept into the cabin, painting the rough-hewn walls with pale light. Isla woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Her scalp still burned, a constant reminder of yesterday's humiliation. The cabin was quiet except for the soft breathing of the dog, Patch, who watched her from his place by the door. Thomas was gone, but the stove was warm, suggesting he hadn't been gone long. Isla sat up, drawing the quilt around her shoulders. Everything felt strange and distant, as if she were moving through a dream. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and Thomas's massive frame. Snow dusted his shoulders and beard, and in his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Patch trotted over to greet him, receiving a brief pat on the head. "Brought bread," Thomas said, unwrapping the package to reveal several golden loaves. "From Wilson's trading post, down the valley." He didn't mention how far he must have walked through the snow to get them. He cut thick slices of the still warm bread and set them before her with a jar of honey. When she hesitated, he added softly, "Need to keep up your strength, ma'am." "Thank you," she murmured, realizing how hungry she was. "But I can't impose on your kindness much longer." Thomas paused in the act of pouring coffee. "Won't take you back to town till you're strong enough," he said, though something in his voice suggested doubt about returning at all. "Not safe yet, besides. Storm's getting worse." As if to prove his words, the wind rose to a howl outside, rattling the cabin's windows. Isla shivered, remembering the cruel faces in town, the feel of scissors against her scalp. Perhaps a few days' delay wouldn't be amiss. The day passed quietly. Thomas went out several times to tend to his mule and bring in more firewood. Isla found herself dozing often, her body demanding rest to heal from the shock and cold. Patch gradually warmed to her presence, eventually accepting a scratch behind his notched ear. Night fell early, brought on by the heavy storm clouds. Thomas built up the fire and prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. The wind's howl had become a constant companion, making the cabin feel like a ship at sea. Isla lay in the bed, wrapped in the quilt, while Thomas sat in his chair by the fire. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a voice so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Lord," Thomas whispered, his head bowed. "I know I ain't worthy to ask, but not for her. For what I done. All them men in the war." His voice cracked slightly. "Their faces still haunt me. The killing can't seem to wash the blood away no matter how hard I try." The words faded into the crackling of the fire, but they echoed in Isla's mind. She turned her face towards the flames, understanding blooming in her heart. They were both lost souls, she realized. She with her grief and shame, he with his burden of guilt. Both seeking refuge from the world's cruelty, finding it unexpectedly under the same roof. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as Isla lay awake, listening to Thomas's soft prayers and the storm's fury. In this moment, the cabin felt less like a temporary shelter and more like something else. Perhaps the beginning of healing for them both. 2 days passed like a dream in the mountain cabin. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful white. But down in Benton's Hollow, uglier things were brewing. The Lucky Strike saloon buzzed with whispers and stern looks as Caleb Hensley slammed his glass on the scarred wooden bar. His face was flushed with drink and anger. "That woman's nothing but a thief," he snarled to anyone who would listen. "Living in sin with that mountain hermit while she holds on to my brother's land ain't natural, ain't right." The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement while others studied their drinks. Caleb's voice grew louder with each shot of whiskey. "I'll see her in court for this. She wants to act like a loose woman, fine, but she won't keep my family's property while she does it." Meanwhile, up on the mountain, the sound of rhythmic chopping echoed through the trees. Thomas's axe rose and fell in steady strokes, splitting logs for the woodpile. Sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the cold air, and his breath came out in white clouds. Inside the cabin, Isla stood before the small mirror Thomas had brought in from his storage shed. Her fingers moved carefully through what remained of her hair, trying to work the short, uneven lengths into some kind of braid. The scissors had left patches almost to the scalp in places, while other sections stuck out at odd angles. Her cheeks burned as she imagined the talk spreading through town. A respectable widow, living unchaperoned with a man? The shame of it settled heavy in her chest, even though Thomas had been nothing but honorable. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made her freeze. Through the window she saw Thomas straighten, axe at the ready, until he recognized the rider. Deputy James Harker dismounted with the ease of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His badge caught the weak winter sunlight as he led his horse toward Thomas, a pack of supplies tied behind the saddle. "Brought what you asked for," Harker said, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. "Figured you could use some extra provisions, weather being what it is." Thomas nodded his thanks, setting down the axe. "Much obliged, James. Come in for coffee?" Isla hurried to put the kettle on as the men stamped snow from their boots at the door. Deputy Harker removed his hat politely when he saw her, but his expression was grave. "Ma'am," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Hope you're recovering from your ordeal." "I am, thank you," Isla replied softly, conscious of her shorn head, even though she'd tied a kerchief over it. The deputy warmed his hands around the cup before speaking again. "Wish I could say I came just to deliver supplies. There's trouble brewing in town." Thomas's face remained impassive, but his shoulders tensed. "Caleb?" Harker nodded. "He's making all kinds of accusations down at the Lucky Strike, calling Mrs. Hensley a thief and worse. Says she's trying to steal his brother's land by—" He glanced apologetically at Isla. "By taking up with another man." "He's the one who drove me out," Isla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who gave him the right to judge where I seek shelter?" "Law's complicated when it comes to widows' rights," Harker said, "especially with grazing rights involved. Caleb's threatening legal action." Thomas had been standing silent by the fire, but now he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Let him come." Isla's hands trembled as she refilled the coffee cups. "Mr. Boone, I can't let you face trouble on my account. Your reputation—" "My reputation?" A hint of a smile touched Thomas's scarred face. "Been a hermit so long, ain't got much of one left to worry about." But Isla saw how the townspeople had drawn back from him that day in the street, how they whispered about the strange mountain man who never came to church. Her presence would only make things worse for him. After Harker left, the cabin felt too quiet. Isla washed dishes mechanically, trying to find words for the question that had been growing in her mind these past days. "Mr. Boone," she finally said, her hands deep in soapy water, "may I ask why you choose to live alone up here?" Thomas was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was rough with memory. "Used to scout for the Union Army," he said. "During the war. Was good at it too. Tracking, reading sign, moving quiet through enemy territory." He paused, staring into the fire. "Too good, maybe. Led our boys right to the enemy time after time. Saw things. Did things." His voice trailed off. Isla turned from the dishes, watching his profile in the firelight. The flames softened the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, but couldn't hide the weight of whatever burden he carried. "Never came home clean," he finished quietly. "Figured it was better to keep to myself after. Safer for everyone that way." Isla dried her hands slowly on her apron. "Is that why you pray at night? For forgiveness?" He looked at her sharply, and she flushed, realizing she'd revealed that she'd overheard his private prayers, but his expression softened. "Reckon so," he said, "though I ain't sure I deserve it." "The Lord's mercy is bigger than our sins," Isla said, surprising herself with the words. How long had it been since she'd spoken of faith, since her husband's death had dimmed her own prayers? Thomas studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "Maybe so, but some stains don't wash away easy." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its warm light. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying rumors down to the town below, where Caleb Hensley's anger grew with each passing hour. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain. Fresh snow glittered on the pine boughs, and Thomas's cabin sat peaceful in the morning light. Inside, Isla stirred porridge over the cook stove, while Thomas cleaned his rifle by the window, a morning ritual she'd noticed in their few days together. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats shattered the quiet. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. Through the frost-traced window, 3 riders appeared on the trail, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. "It's Caleb," Isla whispered, recognizing her brother-in-law's dark coat and proud posture. Her hands began to shake. "Stay inside," Thomas said quietly, moving to the door. His rifle hung loose but ready at his side, pointed at the ground. Caleb Hensley reined his horse to a stop, snow spraying from its hooves. 2 men flanked him, ranch hands Isla recognized from town, both wearing gun belts and hard expressions. "Brought some witnesses," Caleb called out, his voice carrying sharp and clear in the mountain air. "Time to end this foolishness. Isla, come on home to family." Thomas didn't move from the cabin steps. "Mrs. Hensley ain't interested in your kind of family." Caleb's face darkened. "This ain't your business, mountain man. That woman holds deed to land that belongs to the Hensleys. She needs to sign it over proper and come back where she belongs." Despite Thomas's warning, Isla couldn't stay hidden. She stepped out onto the porch, though she kept behind Thomas's broad shoulders. The cold air bit at her exposed scalp, reminding her of her shame. "I won't sign anything," she said, hating how her voice quavered. "That land was James's gift to me, his wife. You have no right." "No right?" Caleb barked a harsh laugh. "Look at you, hiding up here with this hermit, bringing scandal to my brother's good name. Ain't got enough hair left to cover your sin, do you?" Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. His voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "She's my wife now. She stays." The words fell like thunder in the quiet mountain air. Isla's heart stopped, then started racing. Even the horses seemed to freeze, their ears pricked forward. Caleb's face went from red to white. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Thomas didn't raise his voice, but it carried clear as a church bell. "We're to be married. Got no claim on her now." "You're lying," Caleb snarled. "Ain't no preacher would marry you two." "Don't need a preacher. Common law's good enough up here." Thomas shifted his weight, and sunlight caught the rifle barrel. "Now ride on home, Caleb Hensley. Ain't nothing here for you." For a long moment, Caleb sat rigid in his saddle, fury rolling off him in waves. Then he spat, a glob of tobacco juice staining the pristine snow. "This ain't over," he growled. "You'll regret this, both of you." He wheeled his horse around, snow flying. "Come on, boys." The 3 riders thundered back down the trail, leaving churned snow and heavy silence behind. Isla's legs gave out, and she sank onto the cabin steps, shaking. "What have you done?" she whispered. "Mr. Boone, you've ruined yourself. The whole territory will think—" "Think what they please," Thomas said, propping his rifle by the door. "Town won't touch a married woman. You're safe now." He stepped inside, leaving Isla staring at the trampled snow. After a moment, she heard him moving around the cabin, opening drawers. When she finally went in, he sat at the rough table, writing carefully on a sheet of paper. "What is that?" "Letter to the county clerk," he said, not looking up. "Declaring our intent to marry, makes it official in the eyes of the law." Isla watched his large hand move across the paper, forming careful letters. The enormity of what he'd done, what he was doing, pressed on her chest like a weight. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why would you do this for me?" Thomas paused in his writing, still not meeting her eyes. "Man can't stand by and watch evil done, not again." Something in his voice, some old pain, made Isla's throat tight. She moved to the stove where her forgotten porridge had burned to the bottom of the pot. The familiar tasks of cooking and cleaning steadied her hands, if not her heart. They passed the day in strange silence. Thomas went out to check his trap lines, returning with 2 rabbits for supper. Isla cleaned and cooked them, adding the last of her dried vegetables to make a stew. The familiar routine felt different now, charged with new meaning. As darkness fell early, as it did in winter, Thomas lit the lamps and sat in his usual chair by the fire. But instead of taking up his whittling or reading his worn Bible, he simply stared into the flames, lost in thought. Isla finished wiping the dishes and stood uncertainly in the cabin's center. The space felt smaller somehow, more intimate. Every casual movement seemed to carry new weight. Without really deciding to, she sank to her knees beside her bed. Her voice, when it came, was rusty with disuse, but grew stronger with each word. "Dear Lord," she began, speaking aloud for the first time since James's death, "thank you for your protection, for sending help when I needed it most, for—" She hesitated, glancing at Thomas's still form by the fire. "For good men who remember mercy." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and silent. The wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Inside the cabin, warmth and quiet wrapped around them like a blanket. It wasn't peace exactly. Too much lay unresolved between them. Too many dangers waited down in the valley. But it was something like hope, fragile as the first spring flower pushing through winter snow. Thomas added another log to the fire, and sparks rose up the chimney like stars. Neither spoke again that evening, but the silence between them had changed. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound not by love or choice, but by honor and the simple need to stand against cruelty. Isla's last thought before sleep took her was that perhaps this was its own kind of blessing, not the joy she'd once known, but the quiet strength of 2 wounded souls finding shelter in each other's presence. 3 days passed like whispers in the mountain cabin. On the morning of the 4th day, Thomas hitched his team to the wagon while frost still sparkled on the grass. Isla stood in the doorway, fingers trembling as she tied a borrowed bonnet under her chin. The soft fabric couldn't hide the shortness of her hair, but it offered what dignity it could. "Ready?" Thomas asked, helping her up onto the wooden seat. His hand was warm and steady against her elbow. "As I'll ever be," she answered softly. The wagon creaked as Thomas settled beside her, and with a gentle slap of the reins, they began their descent into Benton's Hollow. The late autumn sun climbed higher as they wound down the mountain trail. Isla's hands were clasped tight in her lap, her wedding ring from James a heavy weight on her finger. She'd thought to remove it, but Thomas had shaken his head when she tried. "No shame in remembering," he'd said. The first houses of town appeared through the trees. Isla's heart quickened as they rolled past the livery stable. The street was busy with morning traffic, women heading to the general store, men gathered outside the telegraph office, children racing to school with books in hand. All activity seemed to pause as Thomas's wagon passed. Isla felt the stares like physical things. Women whispered behind their hands. Men turned their backs. A few children pointed at her bonnet before their mothers hustled them away. "Hold your head high," Thomas murmured, eyes fixed ahead. "Ain't nothing here worth fearing." The courthouse stood at the end of the main street, its weathered brick and white columns a poor echo of grander buildings back east. Thomas helped Isla down from the wagon, and together they climbed the wooden steps. Their boots echoed in the empty hallway. Judge Horace Ames's office was small but neat, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner and law books lining the walls. The judge himself sat behind a broad desk, his white hair and beard making him look like a stern prophet from the Bible. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Thomas Boone," he said, setting down his pen. "Been a long time since Shiloh." "Yes, sir, Judge Ames," Thomas answered quietly. Too long. The judge's gaze moved to Isla, taking in her borrowed bonnet and careful posture. Mrs. Hensley, I presume? Yes, Your Honor. Isla's voice came out stronger than she expected. Judge Ames picked up the marriage declaration Thomas had sent ahead. Unusual circumstances bring you here. Very unusual. He studied them both over his spectacles. I need to ask Mrs. Hensley, is this marriage being entered into under any form of coercion or threat? The question hung in the air like smoke. Isla felt Thomas grow still beside her, but he remained silent, letting her answer stand on its own. She lifted her chin, meeting the judge's eyes directly. No, Your Honor. This marriage comes by mercy. Something softened in the old judge's face. He nodded slowly, reaching for his pen. Mercy's a rare thing these days. Could use more of it. The scratch of his signature filled the quiet room. May God's grace go with you both. Outside, the morning had warmed, though wind still bit through Isla's thin dress. Thomas touched her elbow. Wait here, he said, and disappeared into the general store. He returned moments later with a package wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said gruffly, pressing it into her hands. Isla unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a shawl of soft blue wool with a subtle pattern woven through it. Her throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the fabric. Thank you, she whispered, drawing it around her shoulders. Thomas nodded, his eyes gentle though his expression remained serious. They drove home in, comfortable silence, the horses knowing the way. The sun was still well up when they reached the cabin, casting long shadows through the pines. Isla went straight to her usual tasks, stoking the fire, starting supper, sweeping the rough wooden floor. But something had shifted, settled. As she worked, she found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, cleaning his rifle as he did every evening. But when Isla glanced over, she caught the edge of a smile on his weathered face, the first she'd seen since coming to his home. Over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Isla ventured to break their usual quiet. I thought perhaps, if you're willing, we might plant a vegetable garden come spring. The soil looks good on the south side of the cabin. Thomas considered this as he buttered another piece of cornbread. Reckon that would be wise. Could extend the chicken coop too, if you've a mind to keep hens. I would like that, Isla said softly, and the future seemed to open before them like a trail through the trees. But down in Benton's Hollow, other plans were taking shape. Caleb Hensley stood before the sheriff's desk, his hat crushed between his hands, face flushed with righteous anger. It ain't right, he insisted. That mountain man kidnapped my brother's widow, forced her into marriage to steal our land. I'm filing a formal claim dispute. The sheriff, an old-timer who'd seen too many range wars start this way, sighed and began filling out the paperwork. Outside his office, Deputy James Harker listened with growing concern. When Caleb finally stormed out, Harker stepped into the sheriff's office. You know this won't end clean, he said quietly. The sheriff nodded, rubbing his gray mustache. Warn your friend Boone. Trouble's coming, sure as snow in winter. Harker gazed out the window at the gathering clouds. Up on the mountain, Thomas and Isla's cabin sat peaceful in the evening light, smoke rising straight from the chimney into the darkening sky. But peace, he knew, was as fragile as morning frost, and just as quick to melt away. The weeks following their courthouse visit settled into a gentle rhythm, marked by the slow dance of snowflakes outside the cabin windows. Each morning, Isla woke before dawn to the sound of Thomas stoking the stove, his movements careful and quiet as he tried not to wake her. One crisp morning, Thomas led Isla to the small barn, where his lone cow, a gentle brown creature named Maple, stood chewing her cud. "Reckon it's time you learned," he said, setting down the milk pail. "Can't always do everything myself." Isla gathered her skirts and sat on the low stool, watching as Thomas demonstrated the proper grip and rhythm. His large hands moved with surprising gentleness, drawing warm streams of milk into the bucket. "Like this," he said, moving aside so she could try. Her first attempts sent milk spraying sideways, making Maple shift uneasily. Thomas didn't laugh or scold, just adjusted her grip with calloused fingers. "Steady now," he murmured. "She'll trust you if you're patient." By the end of the week, Isla could milk Maple on her own, humming softly as she worked. The cow would turn her head to watch, dark eyes peaceful, while morning light filtered through the barn's weathered boards. Inside the cabin, Isla found other ways to make herself useful. Thomas's clothes were worn thin in places, patches upon patches telling stories of hard use. One evening, she picked up his spare shirt and began to mend it by lamplight. Thomas watched from his chair by the stove, something soft passing across his face. "Much obliged," he said quietly. "Been a while since anyone took needle to my things." Isla smiled, working careful stitches. "These clothes have seen some miles." "That they have." He was silent for a long moment, then added, "Worst wear came during the war. Scouting weren't gentle work." She glanced up, sensing a story in his tone. Thomas rarely spoke of his war years, but tonight something in the stillness seemed to loosen his tongue. "Last day at Appomattox," he continued, his voice low. "Found a Confederate boy. Couldn't have been more than 16, hiding in a barn. Had his rifle aimed right at me." Thomas's hands worked slowly at the piece of wood he was whittling. "I could have shot him. Should have, maybe. But he had eyes like my little brother's, the one I lost to fever years back." Isla's needle paused. "What happened?" "Let him go. His pa saw it happen, though. Old man was dying nearby, gut shot. Cursed me with his last breath for showing mercy. Said it was worse than killing his boy clean." Thomas's knife stilled. Some nights I still hear those words. Isla set down her mending and moved to touch his arm. "Mercy is never wrong, Thomas. Never." He nodded slowly, but she saw the old guilt still heavy in his eyes. As the weeks passed, even Patch began to warm to her presence. The half-wild cur who had once growled at her approach now waited by her chair at mealtimes, hoping for scraps. One morning, Isla found him curled at the foot of her bed, his one good eye watching her trustingly. "Looks like you've won him over," Thomas observed, a hint of smile touching his mouth. "He just needed time," Isla replied, scratching behind Patch's ears, "like some others I know." Their evenings developed a comfortable pattern. After supper, while Thomas carved or cleaned his rifle, Isla would read aloud from her mother's old Bible. Her clear voice filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort, while wind sang in the chimney and snow piled deeper outside. One night, she noticed Thomas was working more intently than usual on a small piece of wood. His big hands moved with delicate precision, shaping something she couldn't quite see. When she tried to peek, he turned away, almost shy. The next evening, he presented her with what he'd made. A wooden comb, carved with simple but elegant patterns. "For your hair," he said gruffly. "It's growing back nice." Isla touched her short locks, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks. The comb was beautiful, smooth as silk under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, and saw Thomas duck his head, pleased but embarrassed by her gratitude. As January eased toward February, the constant blizzards began to slack. Thomas spent one morning lashing together a sturdy sled from spare lumber. "Firewood's running low," he explained. "Thought maybe you'd help me haul some in." Isla pulled on James's old coat, now permanently hers, and followed Thomas into the snowy woods. The sled slid easily over the packed snow, and together they loaded it with split logs from Thomas's woodpile. On the way back, the sled hit a hidden dip, tipping sideways and spilling them both into a snowbank. For a moment, they just lay there, surprised. Then Isla started laughing, really laughing, for the first time since coming to the mountain. After a heartbeat, Thomas joined in, his deep chuckle harmonizing with her lighter one. They helped each other up, still grinning, brushing snow from their clothes. "Reckon that's enough excitement for one morning," Thomas said, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like joy. The peace they'd found felt as delicate and perfect as the frost patterns on the window panes. But like those crystalline designs, it was destined to melt away. The letter arrived on a cold afternoon, brought by a determined post-rider who'd fought through weeks of blocked trails to deliver it. Isla recognized the county court's seal and felt her stomach tighten as she broke it open. Thomas stood by the fire, his face carefully blank as she began to read aloud. "Mr. Thomas Boone," she started, her voice catching slightly. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the county court in Carson City on the 15th of March to answer charges filed by Mr. Caleb Hensley regarding the disputed marriage to and alleged kidnapping of Mrs. Ela Hensley, née Warner." Her hands trembled as she lowered the paper. The summons had been delayed 2 weeks by the heavy snows, but its threat was no less potent for the wait. Thomas hadn't moved, his expression still unreadable in the firelight. "What will you do?" Isla asked softly. "What law requires," he answered. "Appear and speak truth." "And if they believe Caleb's lies?" Thomas finally turned to look at her, his eyes grave but gentle. "Truth's got its own power, Isla. Has to be enough." But as they sat down to their evening meal, the cabin felt colder somehow, their carefully built peace beginning to crack like spring ice on the river. Isla bowed her head to say, "Grace," but the words stuck in her throat. After a moment, Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We'll weather this," he said quietly. "Together." Isla nodded, clinging to his strength, while outside the wind picked up again, sending fresh snow against the windows, like handfuls of thrown sand. Patch pressed closer to her feet, as if sensing her distress, and she reached down to stroke his rough fur. The letter lay on the table between them, its official script gleaming dully in the lamplight, a harbinger of storms to come. The wagon creaked through melting snow as Thomas guided the horses toward Carson City. 2 days of travel stretched before them, the early March sun working to clear winter's grip from the land. Isla sat beside him, wrapped in layers against the lingering cold, her new shawl, the one Thomas had bought her, draped carefully over her shoulders. They made camp the first night in a sheltered grove, Thomas insisting Isla take the wagon bed while he slept on the ground nearby. She listened to the pop of dying embers and his steady breathing, drawing comfort from his protective presence. "Caleb won't give up easy," she said softly into the darkness. "Don't matter none," Thomas replied after a moment. "Truth's on our side." The second day brought them into Carson City just as the sun was setting. The county seat was larger than Benton's Hollow, with brick buildings lining the main street and gas lamps casting pools of yellow light. Thomas found them rooms at a modest boarding house, separate chambers, with a stern-faced landlady who watched them closely. Morning came too soon. Isla stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting her shawl with trembling fingers. Her hair had grown enough to cover most of the uneven patches, though the memory of that day in Benton's Hollow still burned. She touched the wooden comb Thomas had carved her, drawing strength from its smooth surface before tucking it carefully into her pocket. The courthouse dominated the town square, its wooden steps worn from years of boots seeking justice. Inside, the hearing room smelled of pine soap and dust. Isla sat straight-backed on the hard bench, aware of every eye upon them as they waited for proceedings to begin. Thomas's solid presence beside her kept her anchored. When Caleb entered with his lawyer, he barely glanced their way. But Isla felt the hatred rolling off him like heat from a forge. He'd dressed for effect in a fine, store-bought suit, his beard neatly trimmed, every inch the respectable rancher come to rescue his poor sister-in-law. Judge Ames called the court to order, his familiar face stern beneath gray brows. The charges were read: kidnapping, coercion, theft of property through forced marriage. Each accusation fell like a stone in the quiet room. Caleb took the stand first, his voice thick with false concern. "That mountain savage has bewitched her," he declared, shooting Thomas a venomous look. "Living alone up there filled her head with lies. She ain't in her right mind, Your Honor. As her only living kin, it's my duty to protect her interests." "And those interests would be?" Judge Ames asked mildly. "The grazing rights my brother left her. Land that should stay in the family name." Caleb's mask slipped slightly, showing the greed beneath. "She needs proper guidance, not some war-haunted hermit filling her head with nonsense." The judge's expression didn't change, but Isla noticed his fingers drumming slightly on his desk. "Mr. Boone," he said, "you have proof of this marriage?" Thomas stood, his massive frame making the courtroom seem smaller. From his coat, he withdrew the marriage license, handling the paper carefully with his big hands. "Yes, sir. Signed by yourself, if you recall." Judge Ames examined the document, nodding slowly. "I do indeed remember. Mrs. Hensley," he said, turning to Isla, "would you share your account of these events?" Isla rose, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I went with Thomas Boone of my own free will, Your Honor. After what happened in Benton's Hollow." She touched her hair unconsciously, saw several women in the gallery look away. "He offered shelter when I had none, protection when my own family had cast me out. We married proper, before God and law." "Were you coerced? Threatened in any way?" "No, sir." Isla lifted her chin. "Thomas Boone is the most honorable man I know. He took in a stranger out of pure Christian charity, asking nothing in return. If anyone tried to force my hand, it was Caleb Hensley, demanding I marry him to keep my land, then shaming me public when I refused." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Caleb's face darkened, but Judge Ames raised his hand for silence. "I find no evidence of coercion or improper conduct," the judge declared. "The marriage is legal and binding. The property rights remain with Mrs. Isla Boone to manage as she sees fit. This case is dismissed." The gallery erupted in whispers. Caleb surged to his feet, face mottled red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm. With a curse, he stormed from the courtroom, leaving his carefully crafted allegations in shambles behind him. Isla sat very still, relief making her lightheaded. Thomas's hand found hers, warm and steadying. They waited until the room cleared before making their way outside into the pale spring sunshine. The wagon ride home felt different, lighter somehow, as if a shadow had lifted. Near sunset, Thomas unexpectedly pulled the horses to a stop beside a small churchyard. The white-painted building glowed in the fading light, its windows reflecting gold. Without a word, Thomas climbed down and approached the low fence. Isla watched as he removed his hat, bowing his head. His lips moved slightly, and though she couldn't hear the words, she knew he was praying, giving thanks to God for their deliverance. Tears pricked her eyes at this first glimpse of his faith laid bare. When he returned to the wagon, neither spoke of it. But something had shifted between them, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. They reached the cabin well after dark. Thomas insisted on making supper himself, though his cooking skills were basic at best. Isla sat by the fire, watching him move about the kitchen with determined concentration as he prepared their simple meal of beans and cornbread. The food wasn't fancy, but Isla couldn't remember tasting anything better. Perhaps it was the knowledge that they were truly safe now, their marriage blessed by both law and God. Or perhaps it was simply the quiet joy of being home, sharing bread with someone who had become more than just her protector. Patch lay between them, head on his paws, occasionally thumping his tail against the floor. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. The air in the cabin felt different, cleaner somehow, as if all the fear and doubt had been swept away. In its place was something new and precious, trust, hard-won and deeply rooted. As Isla gazed across the table at Thomas, she saw in his eyes the same peace she felt in her heart. They ate without hurry, savoring each bite, each moment. The simple meal had become a communion of sorts, blessed by gratitude and shared understanding. When Thomas reached for her hand to say grace, his rough fingers gentle around hers, Isla felt the holiness of it settle over them like a mantle. The mountain thaw came sudden and fierce that year. March winds tore through the valley, sending waves of melting snow cascading down the slopes. Streams that had slept beneath ice for months burst free, their voices rising in joyous chorus across the awakening land. Isla stood at the cabin's door one morning, breathing in the sharp scent of wet earth and new grass. The world seemed to stretch and yawn around her, shaking off winter's heavy blanket. Near the cabin wall, green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow. Wild onions, she realized with delight. That very afternoon, she began preparing a small plot for planting. Thomas watched from where he mended a broken fence post, his strong hands working the wood as she turned the soil. "Reckon those beans'll grow this high up?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Isla smiled, brushing dirt from her apron. "My grandmother always said beans'll grow anywhere if you ask them proper." She patted the earth gently. "Just needs patience and prayer." Thomas's laugh surprised them both, a deep, warm sound that seemed to startle the chickens scratching nearby. These days, laughter came easier between them, like spring itself had thawed something in their hearts. The days settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings found them sharing coffee by the cook stove, planning the day's work. Thomas would head out to check his trap lines or repair winter damage to the fences, while Isla tended to the cow and chickens before turning to her garden plot. One evening, as sunset painted the cabin walls gold, they sat at the rough-hewn table sharing the last of the coffee. Their hands met briefly over the mug, his calloused fingers brushing her smaller ones, and something electric passed between them. A shy warmth bloomed in Isla's chest as Thomas's eyes met hers, dark and intent. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, looking away. The moment stretched tender and fragile between them, full of unspoken things. Isla felt her cheeks flush, but before either could break the silence, Patch barked outside, announcing a rider approaching. Deputy Harker's arrival brought a chill despite the spring evening. His weather-worn face was grim as he dismounted, declining Thomas's offer of coffee with a sharp shake of his head. "Got news you need to hear," he said, glancing between them. Been watching Caleb Hensley's movements since the trial. Something weren't sitting right. They gathered around the table as Harker laid out what he'd learned. The Hensleys had sold the disputed grazing rights, not to another rancher as expected, but to the Western Pacific Railroad Company. They're planning to divert the mountain spring, Harker explained, his voice heavy. Route it down to their water station in the valley. Railroad's bringing in surveyors next week. Thomas went very still. The spring he'd mentioned was their main water source, feeding both the cabin's well and the grazing meadows where his small herd wintered. They can't just take it, Isla protested. The water rights were clearly laid out in my husband's deed. Harker's expression darkened. Been hearing whispers about money changing hands at the land office, documents appearing and disappearing. He looked at Thomas. Railroad's got deep pockets, friend, and friends in high places. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. The agency clerk in Silver Bluff, Jenkins, he recorded the original water rights. Man's honest, if nothing else. His jaw set with determination. I'll ride out tomorrow, get copies of the true deeds. It's 2 days hard riding, Isla said softly, worry creasing her brow. 3, in this mud, Harker added. But Thomas is right. Jenkins might be our best hope. Railroad hasn't reached Silver Bluff yet with their bribes. They spoke a while longer, Harker sharing what else he'd learned about the railroad's plans. When he finally rode out, the night had grown cold, stars pricking through the clouds above the mountains. Thomas began preparing for the journey immediately, checking his saddle and packing provisions. Isla moved around him, adding bread and dried meat to his saddlebags, her movements quick and anxious. I'll be back soon as I can, he assured her, his voice gentle. Isla nodded, unable to speak past the fear closing her throat. This land had become her sanctuary after the humiliation in Benton's Hollow. The thought of losing it, losing him, made her chest ache. She stayed awake long after Thomas retired to his bedroll by the fire. Kneeling by her narrow bed, she prayed with an intensity that surprised her. Not just for the land, but for Thomas's safe return, for strength to face whatever came next, for wisdom to know the right path. The next morning dawned gray and damp. Thomas left at first light, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the misty distance. Isla threw herself into work to keep worry at bay, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, tending her precious bean sprouts. Each evening, she read her Bible by lamplight, finding comfort in familiar verses about justice and deliverance. Patch proved a faithful companion during the long wait, following her through chores and sleeping outside her door at night. The dog's devotion reminded her of his master's quiet steadfastness, making Thomas's absence even more acute. 3 days stretched into 4 as spring storms rolled through the mountains. Isla found herself standing at the cabin door countless times, straining to hear hoofbeats through the rain. It was well past midnight on the 4th day when Patch's warning bark jolted her from an uneasy sleep. She rushed to light the lamp with trembling hands, setting it in the window as a beacon. Minutes later, Thomas appeared in the doorway, rain-soaked and mud-splattered. Exhaustion lined his face, but his eyes held a fierce light as he laid a leather portfolio on the table. Jenkins had them all, he said, voice rough with fatigue. Every deed, every water right properly witnessed and recorded. Railroads using forged documents. Jenkins compared them himself. Isla's knees went weak with relief. She sank into a chair, watching as Thomas shed his wet coat. Without thinking, she reached for his hand where it rested on the table. He turned his palm up, enfolding her fingers in his warm grip. The touch was different from their accidental brush days before. Deliberate, solid, full of unspoken promise. His thumb traced gentle circles on her wrist as they sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain drum on the roof. In that moment, Isla realized their fight wasn't just for water rights or grazing land. It was for this hard-won peace between them, this sanctuary they'd built from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Thomas's hand tightened on hers, and she knew he felt it too. They were in this together now, come what may. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a calm certainty. Like the spring-fed stream running faithful and true down their mountain, some things couldn't be diverted or bought. They could only be protected, cherished, and allowed to flow where Providence intended. The morning sun cast long shadows through the mountain pines when Deputy Harker's boy rode up to the cabin, waving a yellow telegram envelope. Isla was hanging washing on the line while Thomas split wood nearby, his rhythmic axe strokes echoing against the hillside. "Pa said to bring this straight up," the boy called out, his pony dancing nervously under him. "Said it's important like." Thomas wiped his hands on his shirt and took the envelope, pressing a coin into the boy's palm. Isla drew closer, her heart quickening at the grave look that settled over Thomas's features as he read. "What is it?" she asked, clutching a damp sheet to her chest. Thomas's voice came rough and hollow. "It's from Silver Bluff. The clerk," he swallowed hard, "says Caleb's filed evidence that your husband never died. Claims he deserted from the cavalry 3 years ago." The world tilted beneath Isla's feet. The sheet slipped from her numb fingers into the dirt as darkness crowded the edges of her vision. That's not possible," she whispered. "Says if he's alive, our marriage ain't legal." Thomas's words seemed to come from very far away. "They're sending soldiers to investigate the claim." Isla's knees gave way. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, but his touch felt different now. Hesitant, uncertain. She could feel him pulling away even as his arms supported her. "I buried him," she managed through lips that felt wooden. "I watched them lower his coffin. The cavalry officer brought his effects, his Bible, his wedding ring." Her voice broke on a sob. Thomas helped her to the cabin's front step, but didn't sit beside her as he normally would. Instead, he stood with his back to her, staring out at the mountains as though searching for answers in their snow-capped peaks. "Thomas," she pleaded, "you must believe me. I would never—" "Need to ride into town," he cut her off, his voice flat. "See what else Harker knows." Without looking at her, he strode to the barn and began saddling his horse. Isla watched him go, feeling as though a great chasm had opened between them. The trust they'd built so carefully over these months seemed to crumble like dry earth in a drought. The next 2 days stretched endless and empty. Isla moved through her chores like a ghost, dropping things, burning the bread, starting at every sound that might be hoofbeats. Patch followed her anxiously, whining at her distress. She tried to pray but found no comfort in the familiar words. How could God allow such a cruel lie to take root? Her memories of that terrible day when the cavalry officer arrived rose up unbidden. The formal words of condolence, the carefully wrapped package of James's belongings, the crushing weight of widowhood descending on her shoulders. Thomas returned as dusk was falling on the second day. The set of his shoulders told her everything before he spoke. His face was hard as granite, his eyes cold when they met hers. "Soldiers will be here within the week," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Caleb's got witnesses who say they saw James alive in Dakota Territory last summer." "Witnesses can be bought," Isla said desperately. "You know what Caleb's like, what he'll do to get this land." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. "Maybe so, but why'd the cavalry send a death notice if he just deserted? Something ain't adding up." You think I'm lying?" The words felt like glass in her throat. "I think truth's a hard thing to bury." He set down the untouched coffee and walked out, leaving her alone in the gathering dark. That evening, Isla found herself unable to eat or rest. She paced the cabin until the walls seemed to close in around her. Finally, she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside, needing air that didn't feel thick with unspoken accusations. The spring night was bitter cold, winter not quite ready to release its grip on the mountains. A pale moon cast sharp shadows across the yard. As she rounded the barn, she heard the distinctive clink of glass against glass. Thomas sat on an upturned bucket, a bottle of whiskey at his feet. In all these months, she'd never seen him touch a drop. Though she'd sometimes caught him looking at the bottle he kept high on a shelf, his face haunted by whatever memories it held. "Thomas?" she ventured softly. He didn't look up. "Should go back inside. Getting cold again." "Please," she whispered, taking a step closer. "Please look at me. After everything we've been through, everything we've shared, how can you doubt me now?" His fingers tightened around the bottle. "Shared?" His laugh was harsh in the darkness. "We shared a roof, shared meals, shared lies, maybe?" "No lies," Isla's voice broke. "I swear before God and all his angels I believe James is dead. I mourned him proper. I wouldn't have married you otherwise." "Wouldn't you?" Thomas finally raised his head, and the pain in his eyes struck her like a physical blow. "Way I hear it, you were desperate. Shaved head, no family, no prospects. Maybe I was just convenient." "How dare you?" she breathed, tears freezing on her cheeks. "How dare you make what happened to me into something sordid? You were there. You saw what they did to me. You took me in, protected me, married me to save me from Caleb's schemes, and now you'd believe his lies over my word?" Thomas's hand trembled as he lifted the bottle. "Been wrong about people before. Trusted too easy. Got men killed believing lies wrapped up pretty as truth." The weight of his war ghosts hung heavy in the air between them. Isla knew she was losing him to those old shadows, watching him retreat behind walls she'd thought love had finally breached. "Trust goes both ways," she said quietly. "I trusted you when you took me from town that day. Trusted you were a good man, not just another looking to take advantage. I still trust that. Why can't you trust me now?" He didn't answer. The bottle clinked against his teeth as he took another drink. Isla turned away, her heart splintering in her chest. Inside the cabin, she sank to her knees beside her narrow bed. The tears came then, hot and helpless, soaking her pillow as snow began to fall outside her window. Each icy crystal seemed to mock the warmth they'd found together, the careful happiness they'd built. Patch scratched at her door, whining, but she couldn't bear to let him in. His loyalty would only remind her of what she was losing. So she lay alone in the dark, crying until her throat was raw, while the spring snow erased their footprints from the yard as thoroughly as doubt was erasing their trust in each other. The night grew deeper, and still Thomas didn't come in. Through her window, she could see his shadow by the barn, a solitary figure against the swirling snow. Once, she heard him speak, not to her, but to God, or his ghosts, or both. "Show me the truth, please, before I lose everything again." His words, carried to her on the bitter wind, only made her weep harder. She had thought they were past losing things, past the fear of betrayal. Now she wasn't sure they had ever truly found each other at all. The snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing the awakening spring in winter's shroud, as cold and white as the distance growing between them. 3 days passed like a winter fog, thick with silence. The mountain winds howled outside, but inside the cabin the quiet grew heavier with each passing hour. Isla moved like a shadow through her daily tasks, the weight of Thomas's distrust crushing her spirit more than any physical burden ever could. On the fourth morning, Deputy Harker's horse thundered up the trail. His face was grave as he dismounted, snow falling thick around his shoulders. Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd taken to sleeping, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "Found something," Harker said, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Up by Eagle Pass, near the old supply trail." He reached into his saddlebag with gloved hands. Isla stood in the cabin doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the deputy laid out 3 items on the rough-hewn porch rail: a mud-stained cavalry uniform, a tarnished gold ring, and a soldier's identification tag that gleamed dully in the weak morning light. Thomas picked up the tag, his fingers trembling slightly. "Hensley," he read aloud, his voice flat and cold as the surrounding snow. His eyes lifted to Isla's face, and what she saw there made her stumble backward into the doorframe. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." But Thomas had already turned away, his broad shoulders rigid with anger or grief, perhaps both. "Found it half buried in a washout," Harker explained, looking uncomfortable. "Spring thaw must have exposed it. Looks like it's been there a spell." Isla's legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the doorway. "I buried him," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I watched them lower the coffin. I pressed flowers between Bible pages to remember that day. How can this be?" But Thomas wouldn't look at her. He gathered the items with mechanical precision and carried them into the barn. The door closed with a finality that echoed through Isla's heart like a gunshot. That night, Thomas didn't come in for supper. The stew Isla had prepared grew cold on the stove, untouched. She sat at the table until the lamp burned low, her Bible open before her, but the familiar words offered no comfort. Days stretched into a week. Thomas took to sleeping in the barn permanently, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. The few times their paths crossed, he looked through her as if she were already gone. Each morning, Isla found evidence of his presence. Coffee grounds in the pot, fresh water in the bucket, but never the man himself. In desperation, Isla wrote a letter to Marshal Pritchard, her normally neat handwriting shaky with emotion. "Sir, I beg you to investigate this matter. I know in my heart James died honorably. This found uniform must be some cruel trick. Please help me prove the truth before I lose everything again. With respect, Isla Hensley." But as she sealed the envelope, she knew the mail rider wouldn't come for at least 2 weeks. The mountain passes were treacherous with late spring snow, and time was slipping away like water through her fingers. The cold intensified, unusually bitter for the season. Patch whined at the barn door each night, torn between his 2 masters, until Isla could barely stand the sound. Her prayers grew shorter, then silent, as doubt crept in like frost. Had she somehow been wrong? Had grief played tricks with her memory? But no. She remembered the officer's somber face, the weight of James's Bible in her hands, the terrible finality of that day. One evening, after Thomas once again failed to appear for the meal she'd prepared, something broke inside Isla. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, tucked her worn Bible under her arm, and stepped out into the gathering storm. Snow fell in thick curtains, but she knew the way to the spring. She'd walked it countless times while fetching water, learned its every turn and dip. The frozen creek bed guided her steps as she pushed through deepening drifts. The wind cut through her shawl like knives, but she welcomed the pain. It was better than the hollow ache in her chest, the emptiness where trust had lived and died. Her short-cropped hair offered little protection against the cold, and ice crystals formed on her lashes. but still she walked on. When she reached the spring, its usually vibrant flow now just a trickle between ice-locked rocks, Isla fell to her knees in the snow. She pressed her Bible to her chest and lifted her face to the swirling white sky. "Lord," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind, "I don't ask for happiness anymore. I don't ask for love or warmth or comfort. Just let the truth be known. And if—" her voice caught on a sob, "if I must lose Thomas's trust forever, help me bear it with grace." The storm intensified, but Isla remained kneeling, letting the snow cover her like a burial shroud. She thought of all the moments of tenderness she and Thomas had shared, the wooden comb he'd carved for her, their laughter while hauling firewood, the quiet evenings by the stove. All of it turned to ash by a uniform in the mud and the ghosts of Thomas's past betrayals. "I'll stop seeking human love," she promised into the howling wind. "I'll live alone if that's your will. Just please, Lord, please forgive whatever sin brings this judgment down on me." Her lips moved in familiar prayers, though she could no longer feel them. The cold had worked its way into her bones, but she welcomed it. Perhaps if she stayed long enough, prayed hard enough, God would finally hear her plea for mercy. Snow gathered on her shoulders and in her lap, transforming her into a white statue of supplication. She thought of Thomas in his self-imposed exile in the barn, of the growing distance between them that seemed as vast and impassable as the mountains themselves. Had she lost him forever to these shadows of doubt? Had their careful dance toward love been nothing but a dream? Her prayers grew softer, barely a whisper now, as the storm raged around her. The Bible in her hands felt heavier with each passing moment, its precious pages protected from the snow by her failing body heat. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she should seek shelter, but the thought held no urgency. What shelter remained for her, really, when the home she'd found with Thomas had proved as insubstantial as morning mist? The white world around her began to blur at the edges. Still, Isla prayed, no longer for herself, but for Thomas, that he might find peace, that his war-worn heart might heal, that someday he might learn to trust again, even if not with her. The wind's howl grew distant, as though she were hearing it through layers of wool. Her shawl, heavy with snow, pulled at her shoulders like hands trying to draw her down into the drifts. Yet still she knelt, her faith the only warmth left in her frozen world. "Thy will be done," she whispered, the words barely forming on her numb lips. The storm swallowed her voice, her prayers, her very presence, until she was nothing but another shape in the swirling white darkness, waiting for God's mercy or judgment, whichever came first. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Marshal Pritchard pounded on Thomas's cabin door that night. His fist struck the weathered wood 3 times before Thomas yanked it open, surprise flickering across his weathered face at the sight of the lawman and Deputy Harker standing in the swirling snow. "Marshal, what brings you up here in this weather?" Thomas's voice was rough from disuse. Pritchard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where's Isla?" He stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. Deputy Harker followed, carrying a leather document case. "She's—" Thomas glanced toward the main room, finding it empty. The stew pot sat cold on the stove, untouched. Something twisted in his gut. "I haven't seen her since sundown." "Lord have mercy," Pritchard muttered. He pulled papers from inside his coat. "We rode hard to get here. That body they found? It's a fraud. The Hensleys planted it." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "The ring and tag were stolen from the Silver Bluff Records office last month." Harker spread, documents on the table. "Look here." The serial numbers don't match any soldier named Hensley. And this? He pointed to a deed. Forged. The Hensleys never had rights to sell that ranch land. They've been working with crooked railroad men for months. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Dear God, I didn't believe her. The weight of his mistake crashed over him like an avalanche. I let doubt poison everything. Where would she go? Pritchard demanded. In this storm? Thomas's eyes fell on Isla's empty chair, her Bible missing from its usual place. Then he remembered. The spring. She'd always gone there to pray when troubled. The creek, he breathed. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and ran for the barn. His hands shook as he saddled his horse, his mind racing with images of Isla alone in the killing cold. How long had she been out there? Patch circled anxiously, whining. Find her, boy, Thomas commanded, swinging into the saddle. The dog shot off into the darkness, and Thomas spurred his horse after him. The storm raged fiercer now, the wind cutting visibility to mere feet. Snow plastered Thomas's face, but he trusted Patch's nose to guide them. The dog wove through the trees, following the creek's course where Thomas could barely see it. Isla! His shout was swallowed by the howling wind. Isla! They pushed on through deepening drifts. Thomas's hands grew numb on the reins, but a different kind of cold gripped his heart. Had his pride and suspicion driven her to this? Had his silence condemned her to freeze alone in this white hell? For the first time since the war, Thomas prayed aloud, his words carried away by the storm. Lord, spare her. Take my life if you must, but let her live. I was wrong. So wrong. Patch's bark cut through the wind. Thomas urged his horse forward, and there, a dark shape huddled by the spring, nearly covered in snow. His heart stopped. He leaped from the saddle, stumbling through drifts to reach her. Isla knelt frozen in prayer, her Bible clutched to her chest, snow blanketing her slight form. When he touched her face, her skin was like ice. No, no, no! Thomas gathered her into his arms, her body limp as a rag doll. Isla, forgive me. Please forgive me. He struggled to his feet, cradling her against his chest. Her breath came in shallow wisps, barely visible in the frigid air. The return journey was a nightmare of wind and darkness. Thomas walked beside his horse, holding Isla close, trying to share what warmth he had. Every few steps he prayed, his voice cracking. Lord, give her strength. Don't let her pay for my sin. Please, God, please. Patch led them home, where Marshal Pritchard and Deputy Harker had stoked the fire to blazing. Thomas laid Isla gently before the hearth, his tears freezing on his cheeks as he wrapped her in every blanket they owned. She's breathing, Harker confirmed, checking her pulse. But barely. Thomas knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his. Isla, come back to me. I believe you now. I should have believed you all along. His voice broke. You're the truest soul I've ever known. Hours passed like years. The men took turns feeding the fire while Thomas remained by Isla's side, whispering prayers and apologies between ragged breaths. Patch curled against her other side, lending his warmth. Near dawn, Isla's eyelids flickered. Thomas held his breath as awareness slowly returned to her face. She looked at him with confusion, then recognition. Thomas? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm here. He squeezed her hands gently. The marshal brought proof. You were right about everything. The Hensleys lied. They planted that body to trick us. His voice caught. I should have trusted you. Should have known you'd never deceive me. Isla's eyes filled with tears. You came for me? I'll always come for you. Thomas pressed her fingers to his lips. God led me to you twice now. First in town, then tonight. I won't doubt his wisdom again." Marshal Pritchard stepped forward, holding out the documents. "Ma'am, when you're stronger, these papers prove your innocence. The Hensleys will face justice for their schemes." But Isla's focus remained on Thomas. In her eyes, he saw not condemnation for his doubt, but the same grace that had drawn him from darkness all those months ago. His heart swelled with gratitude and something deeper, something he'd been afraid to name until now. "Rest," he told her softly. "You're safe now. You're home." As morning light began to pierce the storm clouds, Isla drifted into peaceful sleep, her hand still clasped in Thomas's. He sat vigil, watching color slowly return to her cheeks, each breath a precious gift he'd nearly lost to his own stubborn fear. In the quiet dawn, Thomas's prayers changed from desperate pleas to humble thanks. God's mercy had given them both a second chance. This time, he vowed, he would honor it with the faith it deserved. The fever took Isla like a thief in the night. Even as Marshal Pritchard and Deputy Harker departed, color drained from her face, replaced by an alarming flush across her cheeks. Thomas sat beside her, helpless as waves of heat radiated from her slight form, despite the lingering chill of her limbs. "Just hold on," he whispered, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. The cabin's main room became his vigil post, the crackle of the hearth marking endless hours. Patch lay sentinel at the foot of her bed, lifting his head whenever Isla stirred in her delirium. Through the first night, Thomas fought exhaustion as he tended her. His large, calloused hands, more familiar with axe and rifle, now moved with extraordinary gentleness as he spooned water between her parched lips. When she mumbled in fever dreams, he leaned close to catch her words. "The spring must reach the spring," she would murmur, trying to rise. Thomas's heart clenched each time, remembering how he'd driven her there with his silence and doubt. "You're safe now," he would say, easing her back against the pillows. "Rest easy." As dawn broke that first day, Thomas reached for Isla's worn Bible. Its pages fell open to the Psalms, well thumbed and marked with pressed flowers. His voice, rough from disuse, filled the cabin as he began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The familiar words felt different now, weighted with new meaning. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." When his voice grew hoarse, he switched to prayer. Hour after hour, he poured out his heart to God, confessing his pride, begging for Isla's recovery, offering anything in exchange for her life. The words flowed easier now than they had in years, as if a dam had broken inside him. Deputy Harker returned near sunset with medicines from town, but Isla's fever held fast. Thomas dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake at her slightest movement. The second night stretched longer than the first, each hour marked by the steady drip of melting icicles outside. "Please, Lord," Thomas prayed, as false dawn painted the cabin walls in gray. "I've asked nothing since the war, but I'm asking now. Spare her. Let me make this right." Morning brought no change. Thomas read more psalms, his voice growing stronger with practice. He chose verses of hope and healing, letting David's ancient words fill the silence between Isla's labored breaths. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Near noon on the second day, Isla's fever finally broke. Thomas had been dozing, Bible open in his lap, when he felt her hand move in his. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear for the first time in 2 days. "Thomas?" Her voice was weak but lucid. He slid from his chair to kneel beside her bed, his heart thundering. "I'm here." His fingers tightened gently around hers. Been here all along. Isla's gaze drifted around the cabin, taking in the medicine bottles, the rumpled blankets, the Bible on his lap. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You've been reading to me? Thomas nodded, throat tight. Seemed right. Your faith. It's always been stronger than mine. He drew a shaky breath. Isla, I need to tell you something. She waited, patient as always, while he gathered his courage. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in her short, regrown hair, making them shine like frost. That day in town, when I claimed you as my wife, I did it to protect you, to give you shelter from Caleb and his schemes. Thomas's voice roughened. But somewhere along the way, it became real, not just on paper, not just for show. He bowed his head, pressing her hand to his forehead. I love you now. Truth is, maybe I have all along. And I need you. Need you to help save what's left of my soul. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Patch's quiet whine and the drip of melting snow outside. When Thomas finally raised his eyes, he found Isla watching him with tears on her cheeks. Then stand with me before God this time, she whispered, not just before men, not just before the law. Her fingers tightened on his. Let's make our vows to him, Thomas. Let's build something real on faith, not fear. Relief and joy crashed through Thomas like a spring flood. I promise, he said hoarsely. Soon as you're strong enough, we'll do this proper. Before God and whoever else you want there. Isla's smile, though tired, lit up her whole face. I'd like that. Thomas helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. When he moved to step away, she caught his hand. Thank you for finding me, for bringing me home. Thank God for that, Thomas said softly. He led me to you both times, first in town, then in the storm. Won't waste his mercy again. He opened the cabin door to let in fresh air and gasped at the sight. The storm had cleared completely, leaving the world transformed. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, glittering like diamonds in the morning sun. The air smelled clean and new, full of possibility. Isla's short hair caught the light as she turned toward the open door, the pale strands glowing like a crown. Thomas watched her face soften with wonder at the view, and his heart swelled with gratitude. Here was his miracle. Not just that she lived, but that she could still find beauty in the world after all she'd endured. It looks baptized clean, she murmured, echoing his thoughts. Fresh start, Thomas agreed. For all of us. Patch trotted over to lay his head on Isla's lap, tail wagging gently. She scratched behind his ears, her other hand still linked with Thomas's. The morning light poured through the doorway, warming them all in its glow. In that moment, Thomas felt the last shadows of his guilt and doubt begin to melt away, like snow before the spring sun. God's grace had given them both a second chance, at love, at faith, at building something true together. This time, he knew, they would build it on the surest foundation of all, not just marriage papers or legal claims, but the bedrock of forgiveness, trust, and abiding love. Spring arrived like God's own blessing, melting winter's grip from the mountain slopes. The transformation seemed to mirror the changes in Thomas and Isla's world as Marshal Pritchard's investigation bore fruit at last. The marshal rode up to their cabin one crisp morning, his weathered face bearing good news. We've got him, he announced, dismounting with practiced ease. Found papers in Caleb's desk, forged documents, backdated contracts, even telegrams proving conspiracy with certain railroad men. He pulled out several official-looking papers. The railroad's withdrawing their claim entirely. They want no part of this scandal. Thomas stood straighter, his hand finding Isla's. "And Caleb?" "Him and his cohorts fled last night, left nothing but dust and debts behind." The marshal's eyes crinkled. "There's warrants out now. They won't be troubling you folks again." Isla's grip tightened on Thomas's hand. "Thank you, Marshal," she said softly, "for believing us." "Truth has a way of coming to light, ma'am. Always does." With spring's warmth came the work of renewal. Thomas and Isla spent long days rebuilding the fences Caleb's men had torn down. They worked side by side, Thomas showing her how to string wire and set posts. Their labor felt like healing, each repaired section marking another victory over the past. The fertile earth called to them. They planted early crops together: potatoes, peas, and hardy greens. Isla's hands, once soft from town life, grew calloused alongside Thomas's as they worked the soil. Each evening, they'd wash up together at the pump, their laughter carrying across the yard while Patch circled their feet. In town, the atmosphere had shifted like the weather. Where once there had been whispers and sidelong glances, now there were friendly nods and warm greetings. The truth about Caleb had opened many eyes, turning shame to respect for the couple who'd stood firm against injustice. One Sunday morning, the preacher himself made the long ride up to their cabin. He removed his hat, standing awkwardly before them until he found his voice. "Mrs. Hensley, Mrs. Boone," he corrected himself. "I've come to apologize. That day in town when they—" He swallowed hard. "I looked away when I should have spoken up. A shepherd's meant to protect his flock, not abandon them to wolves." Isla's face softened. "God's mercy covers all our failings, Reverend. Would you consider coming back to teach the children their hymns again? They miss you something fierce." Thomas watched his wife's eyes fill with tears of joy. "I'd like that very much." The following week found Thomas up on the church roof, hammer in hand. The ancient shingles had needed replacing for years, and he took satisfaction in each new board he laid. Below, Isla's clear voice led the children in "Amazing Grace," the sound rising up to him like a prayer. Winter's isolation melted away as surely as the snow. Friends began stopping by. Deputy Harker with news from town, women from church bringing pies and company, even old trappers Thomas had known for years. The cabin that had once been his fortress of solitude now rang with voices and laughter. One perfect evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, Thomas and Isla sat together on their porch. The creek, freed from ice, sang its eternal song below them. Thomas pulled out his pocket knife and a piece of wood he'd been working on in secret moments. Isla watched his hands move, strong and sure, as he put the finishing touches on a delicately carved wooden comb. The teeth were fine and even, the handle decorated with tiny flowers that matched the ones beginning to bloom in their garden. "For you," he said simply, placing it in her palm. Isla ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the hours of careful work represented in each detail. Her hair had grown out some, though it would be months before it reached its former length. But the shame of that day was gone, burned away by love and justice and grace. Thomas watched her face in the fading light. "You're the strongest person I ever knew," he told her quietly. "Facing down all that hate with nothing but dignity and faith. You taught me what real courage looks like." Isla leaned against his shoulder. The new comb clutched close to her heart. Below them, the freed creek reflected the evening sky, its waters running clear and true toward tomorrow. The mountain chapel stood small but proud against the April sky, its weathered boards freshly swept for the occasion. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the wildflowers that filled tin cups along each sill. Purple lupins and golden columbines gathered by the ladies of the congregation. Their sweet fragrance mingled with the crisp mountain air drifting through the open door. Inside, the wooden pews held nearly every soul from Benton's Hollow. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their Sunday best brightening the humble space. Even Deputy Harker had polished his badge and combed his unruly hair. Marshal Pritchard stood near the back, his usual stern expression softened by the day's significance. Thomas Boone shifted his weight at the altar, tugging at the collar of his newly pressed shirt. His face, freshly shaven for the first time in months, made him look younger, almost boyish in his nervousness. His huge hands, more accustomed to rope and rifle than ceremony, fidgeted with his borrowed tie. But his eyes remained fixed on the chapel door, waiting. When Isla appeared in the doorway, a collective breath moved through the gathering. She wore a simple blue dress that caught the light like mountain water. Her short hair, grown out some since winter, framed her face in soft waves. She carried no flowers, only her mother's worn Bible pressed close to her heart. Thomas's hands stilled at the sight of her. All his nervous energy transformed into something like awe as she walked slowly down the narrow aisle. Her steps were steady, her head held high, so different from that terrible day months ago when she had knelt in the dirt. Now she moved with quiet dignity, transformed by grace and love. The preacher's voice filled the chapel with warmth as he spoke of mercy rising from ashes, of love that endures all storms. He reminded them how God's greatest gifts often come disguised as trials, how faith can transform even the deepest wounds into wisdom. These two souls, he declared, have already weathered more than many face in a lifetime. They've learned that true marriage is built not on convenience or custom, but on mercy, trust, and abiding faith. When the time came for vows, Thomas's deep voice carried clear and strong through the chapel. Gone was the reticent mountain man who had once hidden from his own heart. In its place stood a man transformed by love, speaking his promises without hesitation or doubt. Isla's responses rang with quiet certainty. Her eyes never left Thomas's face as she pledged herself to him, not in desperate necessity this time, but in freely chosen love. Before God and before men, the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, his words carrying the weight of divine and earthly law combined. The congregation rose as one, their reverent silence more powerful than any cheers could have been. Outside, spring had painted the valley in tender greens and golds. Birdsong filled the air, carried on the gentle wind that swept down from the peaks. Thomas helped Isla onto their waiting horse, then swung up behind her. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "Come be my wife, and stay." Her smile was answer enough as they rode toward home together. The sun broke over the mountain peaks, setting the world ablaze with promise. Each familiar bend in the trail felt new somehow, blessed by the day's sacred joy. As dusk began to gather, they crested the final rise above their cabin. It stood warm and welcoming in the failing light, windows glowing with lamplight from within. Smoke curled up from the chimney like a prayer fulfilled, rising straight and true toward the darkening sky. They had left as two souls bound by necessity. They returned as one heart, united in faith and love. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.